I'm back for another lesson in Ivy history for the Cold War. Today we're going to be talking about the division of Germany and Europe from 1948 to 1952. I will cover from 1948 to 1952, during which two German states, the Federal Republic of Germany, or FRG, and the German Democratic Republic, or GDR, were created, and the division of Europe was consolidated into a Soviet bloc and Western bloc. We're going to begin with the division of Germany, with the question of why and how were the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic created. Please take a screenshot of this diagram or write it in your notes because this is the way that this section of the presentation is set up. The foreign ministers of Britain, France, and the US and the USSR met in London in November 1947 in yet another attempt to find a solution to the problem of what to do with Germany. The US vigorously supported the idea of Western European integration and was at least temporarily resigned to the division of Germany. The USSR still wished to avoid the partition of Germany, as this would result in the great industrial complex of the Ruhr becoming a part of the US-dominated Western European bloc. Yet at another London conference in 1947, the Soviets accused Britain and the US of violating the Potsdam Agreement and of denying the USSR its fair share of reparations, while the Western powers rejected Soviet proposals for forming a German government, which would govern a united Germany, because they feared that the Soviets would gain control of Germany as a whole. No more four-power cooperation, it became the East versus the West. The decision to create a West German state came after when Britain, France, and the US and the Benelux states, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, met to discuss the establishment of this new state. France was extremely cautious. Britain and the US had to promise strict control. The production of the great industrial center of the Ruhr, for example, was to be regulated by the International Ruhr Authority, which would be controlled by the Western Allies. West Germans would also have to accept the occupation status, which would give Britain, France, and the US far-reaching powers over trade, foreign relations, economic issues, and disarmament. On June 7th, Germans in the Western zones were granted permission to create a constitution for a democratic federal West Germany. A federal nation meant a country formed of several different states that have considerable autonomy in domestic affairs. On June 20th, the Western Allies, without consulting the Soviet Union, introduced a new currency for Western Germany, the Deutschmark, or German mark. 4 days later, the Soviets responded by introducing a new currency for their Eastern German zone, the Ostmark, or East Mark. The Soviets believed that they could force the Western Allies to abandon their plans for a West German state by applying pressure to West Berlin, which was controlled by the Western Allies but separated from the rest of Germany due to its location in the Soviet zone in Eastern Germany. West Berlin was totally dependent on the rail and road running through the Soviet control zone for its supplies of food and new materials from Western Germany. Starting in March 1948, Soviet forces began to restrict the movements of people and goods between West Berlin and Western Germany. Because Berlin was still in Eastern Germany, it was an issue to actually get supplies for the western part of Berlin, which was the capital of Germany. The Western Allies decided to supply West Berlin with goods transported by aircraft. This is called the Berlin Airlift. This airlift would follow routes or corridors that the Soviet Union had granted the Western Allies in 1945. By the end of July 1948, British and US aircraft were flying a daily average of 2,000 tons of food and raw materials into West Berlin, which wasn't nearly enough for the amount of people there. The three Western allies met in Moscow on the 2nd of August 1948, with the Soviet government trying to reach an agreement whereby West Berlin could gain access to the roads and railroads that could supply that part of Berlin. The Soviets rejected their proposal. No one would compromise again, especially over the economic unity of Berlin. As early as June 28th, the UN Secretary General suggested to Britain and the US that Article 99 of the UN Charter might be applied to the Berlin crisis, as it threatened the maintenance of international peace and security. The issue was discussed by the Security Council in October, and the President of the Council created a mediating committee with the Security Council representatives from Belgium, Canada, China, Colombia, and Syria. Their proposals were again turned down by the parties involved. The UN appointed a financial committee which suggested that the Ostmark should be the sole currency in Berlin and controlled by a new German bank of emission, which would have 8 representatives, 5 of which would be appointed by the Soviet Union. This was unacceptable to the Western Allies since decisions would be made by the majority vote and result in Soviet control of the bank. In March 1949, the Deutschmark was introduced by the Western Allies into West Berlin as its sole currency, thus rejected Soviet and UN proposals. By the end of January 1949, it became clear that the Stalin's plan to force the Western Allies to abandon their plans for establishing an independent Western Germany was failing. The winter of 1948-49 was exceptionally mild, and thanks to the effective deployment of the large U.S. transport aircraft, the average daily deliveries for Western Berlin in January was of around 5,600 tons. By April, this reached 8,000 tons per day. Seeing those failed efforts, Stalin agreed to end the blockade and the promise of multiple discussions. Because of this, we're going to be seeing the emergence of two German states. I'm going to explain both of them. The future shape of Germany was effectively decided by the end of 1948. Stalin failed to deter the Western Allies from pressing ahead with their plans for establishing the Federal Republic of Germany, or FRG. And in the end, he had little option but to create a communist East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, as a counterweight and alternative to the FRG. The Federal Republic of Germany, FRG, was basically created around the Constitution. The West German Constitution was approved in the spring of 1949 by the three Western Allies, and elections for the new parliament, the Bundestag, took place in August. Konrad Adenauer became the first West German Chancellor. The FRG was, however, not fully independent. The occupation statute, which came into force in September, replaced the military government in the former Western zones with a high commission. This still gave Britain, France, and the US the final say on Western German foreign policy, security questions, and exports. The Socialist Unity Party, or SED, in East Germany, established a German People Council, the Volksrat, of 400 delegates, a quarter of whom were communists from West Germany, to draft a constitution for a united German state. If a unified Germany proved impossible to create, then this constitution, the SED believed, would form the basis of a new alternative Germany state, East Germany. Although it resembles the constitution of West Germany, it masks the reality that East Germany would be a single-party state. In May, a Parliament, the People's Congress, was elected with voters with a pre-approved list of candidates who represented SED positions, a method used throughout Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe. When German unity was not going to happen, the German Democratic Republic, or GDR, was created. On October 12th, the government of the GDR was formed and the Soviet military occupation of the zone came to an end. Although a Soviet control commission was set up, which, like the Allied High Commission in the West, retained considerable control over the GDR. So again, a similar thing is going to happen in Germany as it is in other Eastern European states. The USSR is going to be controlling the German government through the Communist Party, and they're going to be gaining absolute control of the states through this involvement of the Communist Party altogether. The division of Germany ensured that Berlin remained a divided city within a divided state. Politically, each side opposed and demonstrated against each other. Once the FRG was created, Britain, France, and the US permitted West Berlin to send representatives to sit in the West German parliament in Bonn, the FRG's capital. But as the whole of Berlin was still legally under four-power control, they had no voting rights. Legally, West Berliners were not yet citizens of the FRG. East Berlin became the capital of the new GDR. Only in 1961 was a barrier erected between East and West Berlin, the Berlin Wall. And on the right-hand side, we see how this Berlin Wall shaped the formation of Berlin as an industrial city. Again, we're going to be seeing even different issuance of lights and light fixtures between the East and the West for in a aerial view of the city. Now, for the second section of this presentation, Western European rearmament. Why was Western European military power strengthened from 1948 to 1952? In January 1948, the planned creation of a West German state was viewed with deep mistrust not only in Eastern Europe and in the USSR, but also in many other Western European countries. So please, take a screenshot of this diagram, organize it in your notes. This is how this section of the presentation is structured. So again, we're seeing this divided Germany. We're going to be seeing two states completely, and these are the two flags that represent them. The Brussels Pact was signed by Belgium, Britain, France, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands in 1948. The pact promised that each of the signatory states would defend the other pact members against any aggressor whatsoever. The treaty also contained clauses on cultural and social cooperation and a provision for creating a consultative council where pact states could discuss mutual issues of concern. The Prague coup and the Berlin blockade finally persuaded the US that there was a need to commit formally to the defense of Western Europe. From the spring of 1948 through to early 1949, the US gradually developed the framework for a North Atlantic Western European military alliance with its allies in Europe. To persuade the US Congress to agree to commit troops to the defense of Europe, US President Truman stressed that the treaty did not oblige the US to go to war without the consent of Congress. In the end, Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty contained the rather imprecise wording that each treaty member will take such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain security in the North Atlantic area. The North Atlantic Treaty was signed on April 4, 1949, for an initial period of 20 years. It included Canada, the US, Brussels, Pact powers, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, and Portugal, and it came into force in August 1949. The rearmament of the FRG came to be after the creation of NATO. Soviet strength, despite the foundation of NATO in April 1949, was still needed to defend itself. There was a strong feeling among its members in the winter of 1949-1950 that they were militarily threatened by the Soviet Union and its satellite countries. In August, when the USSR successfully tested its first atomic bomb, this feeling was reinforced. In 1948, tank production plans called for an annual increase from 1,100 to around 4,000 tanks, and production of artillery was quadrupled. Then in October, the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, drove the nationalists with whom they had been fighting a civil war from mainland China to Taiwan. China was now a communist state and a new powerful ally to Soviets. So basically, we're seeing this Russian re-strengthening of their own state, where we're going to be seeing the Soviet Union launching their first atomic bomb, the Soviet Union earning a huge ally, and basically re-strengthening their position both in the East and in the West of the world, obviously. The Korean War changed the situation dramatically. The invasion of South Korea by communist North Korean troops on June 25th, 1950, appeared to many in Western Europe and the US to be a prelude to a new global conflict in which the Soviets would finally overrun Western Europe. It was assumed that North Korea acted under Stalin's orders, and this fear was reinforced when East Germany's leader, Albrecht, not only supported North Korean aggression, but appeared to recommend similar action as a way of unifying Germany. The creation of a new East German paramilitary police force of around 60,000 men gave some substance to these threats. In light of the Korean War and Albrecht's statements in East Germany, West German rearmament was viewed as essential to strengthen the defenses of Western Europe, with France expressing vast opposition because, they were conquered by the Nazis. In 1950, the French Prime Minister René Pleven proposed the formation of the European Defense Community, EDC. This was known as the Pleven Plan. Its purpose was to create a European army under supranational control with a European Minister of Defense responsible to a European Assembly, which would be appointed by the participants' governments. To ensure that the FRG was kept under control, its troops would join not in divisions, but instead in battalions. And this would allow them to actually compose groups of 800 troops instead of 10,000 troops. The Spofford Compromise was the first version of the Pleven Plan. It was kind of unworkable. After prolonged discussions, a workable compromise was realized that would ultimately enable German troops to be recruited. This proposed that parallel with the creation of a European army, NATO itself would create an integrated force in Europe. It would serve medium-sized German units, which would be subject to tight supervision by Western allies. There's going to be obviously strains within NATO, and we're going to be seeing those strains from 1950 to 1951. So throughout the first half of 1951, the West German rearmament question and the US policy in Korea put an immense strain on the unity of the alliance. France and many other of the smaller Western European states dreaded German rearmament, while the US allies in NATO were worried that it would use nuclear weapons in Korea and so trigger a third world war. However, NATO allowed for multiple nuclear bombs to be placed all across Europe and the Middle East as well. The escalating conflict in Korea put further pressure on the alliance. When troops from the Communist People's Republic of China, PRC, came to the assistance of North Korea in November 1950, Western Europeans were alarmed by rumors that the US would retaliate by dropping nuclear bombs on the PRC, and feared that it would lead to an all-out war and the withdrawal of US troops from Europe. President Truman refused on the grounds that he could not appease communism in Asia while containing it in Europe, but he did reassure him that the atomic bomb would not be used. Once the PRC had sent troops into North Korea, it was clear that the war would continue into an indefinite future. This strengthened the Republican Party in the US Congress. They believed that the US should take a more aggressive stance against both the USSR and the PRC, the People's Republic of China. In October 1951, as a result of US pressure, detailed negotiations on the EDC started in Paris. The key issue was still French determination to prevent Germany from becoming a major military power again. France vetoed German membership in NATO and insisted on restricting the size of German units that could be integrated into this European military. The General Treaty that replaced the occupation statute was signed on May 26, 1952, and the EDC Treaty a day later in Paris. Afterwards, there was a long, unsuccessful struggle to have the treaties ratified by the nation's parliaments of France and West Germany, because obviously they were against each other in the formation of those armies. The Korean War and the Soviet development of the atomic bomb forced US President Truman to make rearmament his government's overriding priority in Europe. The US began to develop the hydrogen bomb shortly after the outbreak of the Korean War and tripled military spending. Marshall aid was at first diverted to those Western European industries that were vital for rearmament, and then in 1951 stopped altogether in favor of a direct military assistance program. We need to focus on the phrase gun and butter. This phrase was initially used in the US press in 1917 to describe the production of nitrates, both for peaceful and military purposes. Now usually used to describe the situation when a country's economy can finance both increase in military and consumer good production. Bread and guns and butter was used in the United States because they have the capacity to increase their economy and also increase their gun production to salvage or to help both Europe and Asia in their fight against communism. The Organization for European Economic Cooperation, or the OEEC, was convinced that Western Europe faced a great economic crisis that could only be solved by a second Marshall Plan. This organization called for a dramatic 25% expansion of Western Europe's industrial production over the coming 5 years. It proposed financing both rearmament and increased consumer goods production. This was summarized as a policy and the introduction of both guns and butter. Steadily growing demand for industrial goods and vehicles helped make this plan successful. For the next 20 years, Western Europe enjoyed a period of unparalleled prosperity, which in turn encouraged further economic and political integration and consolidated the Western Bloc. Stalin attempted to counter the threat of NATO and German rearmament in two ways. He launched the communist-led World Peace Movement, which campaigned for disarmament and world peace. It offered the FRG the prospect of joining a neutral united Germany. Obviously, his plans were not accepted by any other party. Now, this third section of the presentation is on the consolidation of the rival blocs. Our guiding question is, how did the polarization of Europe into two rival blocs accelerate during the years of 1950 to 1952? Again, please take a screenshot of this diagram, use it in your notes. This is how this section is structured. Western integration was determined by two key factors. On the one hand, the US intended to rebuild Western Europe in the image of the US. They hoped that a European political and economic union would create a United States of Europe. This would in turn deter people from wanting communist governments, significantly boost world trade, provide valuable markets for both US exports and imports, and eventually draw the Eastern European states out of the Soviet bloc. France and the smaller European states saw Western political and economic integration as providing the key to harnessing the great industrial resources of the FRG to the defense of Western Europe against communism and the USSR without the risk of Germany. Britain, however, refused to commit to itself to further integration with Europe and instead insisted on cultivating its close links with the US and the British Commonwealth. The British government put forward the alternative strategy of using NATO as a means of rearming West Germany, enough aligning it firmly with the Western powers within NATO. So we can see that the British and the US are going to be working rather together, but the British and the French are going to be kind of splitting apart because they have different interests in this time period. In May 1950, France's Foreign Minister Robert Schuman announced a plan to create the European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC. The Schuman Plan, as it was called, would enable the Western Allies to exploit Germany's coal and steel resources for their own rearmament programs, without running the risk of simultaneously building a strong and independent West Germany. It was welcomed by most Western European states, with Britain being the only unwilling to join. The ECSC was formed in July 1952 and replaced the International Rural Authority with a new supranational organization, controlled by the 6 member states, the Benelux countries, France, Italy, and the FRG. The ECSC regulated all their coal and steel industries, guaranteeing that the economic needs of each member for these vital raw materials will be met. The ECSC laid the foundation for Western European economic and ultimately political integration. This was the basics of the European Union later on. From 1948, communists dominated the governments of what became known as the Eastern Bloc states. Theoretically, each state within the Soviet bloc remained independent, but all adopted identical cultural, military, economic, and social policies. To further encourage and support closer relations between the various communist states in the Eastern Bloc, the Soviets created 2 supranational organizations, Cominform and Comecon. Cominform, the Communist Information Bureau, was established in September 1947 to promote ideological unity among the communist parties in Europe. All the Soviet bloc communist parties joined as did the French and Italian parties. Its main task was to complete the Sovietization of the Soviet satellite states, to coordinate the activities of the communist parties in both the Soviet bloc and throughout the world, and to combat what was termed Titoism. In November 1949, Cominform was given the task of mobilizing a Soviet-backed peace movement. At a time when rearmament was causing severe strains on the Western European economies, Stalin intended to use this peace movement to appeal to the fears of many Western Europeans. In 1949, with the assistance of the Cominform, the World Committee for the Partisans for Peace was created to organize the peace movement. In early 1951, it handed this task to a World Peace Council elected by the Soviet-dominated Congress of the Partisans of Peace. In March 1950, the Council launched its Stockholm Appeal demanding the banning of the atomic bomb and the condemnation as war criminals of whichever government used it first in conflict. So we can see how the Soviets are directly appealing to this sense of peace in order to promote disarmament, promote the restraint of nuclear usage, and to actually get people to rally behind them. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, was founded in 1949 by the USSR, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Romania, and joined in 1950 by the GDR, or Western Germany, or Eastern Germany. In Western Europe and the US, it was seen as the Soviet response to the Marshall Plan. Its main task was to integrate the economies of Eastern Europe with the USSR. Although there was no effective economic integration in the Soviet bloc until after 1959, the individual states broadly followed the Soviet pattern of economic development. Agriculture was collectivized, centralized economies were established, 5-year plans laid the foundations for large-scale industrialization. So these are the three main factors that are going to be leading to the creation of the Soviet-controlled European states. Again, they're going to be collectivizing their agricultural spheres, nationalizing their industries, and working together for 5-year plans. The only effective ties strengthening the bloc were the network of bilateral treaties of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance signed between the USSR and the individual satellite states, and also between these states themselves. Each of these treaties contained the following agreements: a mutual defense agreement, a ban on joining a hostile alliance such as NATO, recognition of equality, sovereignty, and non-interference in each other's internal affairs, although obviously in practice this does not deter the USSR from intervening in the domestic policies of its satellites. Red Army garrisons were maintained throughout Eastern Europe to provide defense as well as to ensure that governments remained under Soviet control. The armed forces of satellite states was completely integrated. Each army was issued with Soviet equipment, training manuals and armaments. Military uniforms and equipment in the Eastern blocs were identical, and Soviet military commanders were placed in charge of all forces. The Stalin cult was also a unifying factor in the Eastern Bloc. He was celebrated everywhere as the builder of socialism in the USSR and the liberator of Eastern Europe in the Second World War. Here's an excerpt from God's Playground, A History of Poland by Norman Davis. I'm going to read it to you. The habits of Stalinism penetrated into every walk of life in Poland. Statues of Stalin appeared in public spaces. The republic's leading industrial center, Katowice, was renamed Stalinograd. Everything and anything from the Palace of Culture in Warsaw downwards were dedicated to the name of J.V. Stalin. Soviet civilization was upheld as the universal paragon of virtue. Nonconformity of any sort was promptly punished. The militiaman and the petty bureaucrat walked tall. By 1949, not only was Europe divided into two blocs, but within the Eastern Bloc there also emerged a split between the USSR and Yugoslavia. Stalin had growing concerns with Tito. In the course of winter of 1947, The friction between the Soviets and the Yugoslav increased as Tito alarmed Stalin with the talk of forming a Balkan Federation, which would include Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania. The leaders of both Bulgaria and Romania responded enthusiastically to these proposals. Communist Party officials from Bulgaria and Yugoslavia were summoned to Moscow in February 1948. Stalin specifically vetoed the stationing of Yugoslav troops in Albania, and instead of the wider federation favored by Tito, proposed a smaller Bulgarian-Yugoslav union. The two states were required to commit themselves to regular consultations with Soviet officials on foreign policy questions in an effort to prevent independent action. Tito refused and rejected the union. Stalin reacted to this open defiance of this leadership by withdrawing Soviet advisors and personnel from Yugoslavia and accused its leaders of being politically and ideological criminals. The entire Eastern European bloc was pressured into isolating Yugoslavia and expelled it from the organization. Yugoslavia was the first communist state to act independently of the Soviet Union. Soviet attempts to remove Tito came to be as well. Initially, Stalin hoped that the Yugoslav Communist Party would overthrow Tito, but Tito rapidly purged the party of pro-Cominform suspects. Soviet attempts to assassinate Tito were also unsuccessful, as were the attempts to apply economic pressures through a trading embargo. These threats led Tito to turn to the West for assistance. Tito abandoned his support for Greek communist rebels and in return received arms and financial assistance from Britain and the US. Close links developed between the CIA and the Yugoslavian Secret Service. In 1954, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Turkey, both of whom were NATO members, signed the Balkan Mutual Defense Pact aimed at the USSR and its allies. So again, this is called the Balkan Mutual Defense Act. It's going to be between the Greece, the Yugoslavian government, Turkey, and it's obviously going to have the aid of the British and the US. Tito's break with the USSR in 1948 demonstrated that the unity of the Soviet bloc was more fragile than it appeared to many observers. This encouraged NATO to explore various ways of weakening the USSR's position in Eastern Europe. The US and Britain gave military and economic assistance to Yugoslavia. Between 1949 and 1952, there was a series of unsuccessful operations by the US and Britain to remove Albania's communist leader, Enver Hoxha, as a step towards replacing its Soviet-sponsored government. Attempts were also made to undermine Soviet authority by constantly filing complaints to the United Nations about human rights abuses in the Eastern Bloc. Eastern European refugees were helped financially so as to encourage others to flee from the Soviet bloc. Radio Free Europe was broadcasted. Anti-Soviet propaganda was created to Eastern European to send to Eastern European states, and they were sponsored by the U.S. government. Thank you so much for David Williamson, and we recognize the authors of all visual and auditory content that is included in this presentation. Thank you for listening.